We're going to talk about Android design. We're going to look at the history of UI design in Android. We'll talk about the current approach to design called material design and more recently Material U. And we will look at some basic examples and talk about how these types of things can be incorporated into your applications when building user interfaces. So, in the beginning, when Android was first released, there was precious little, if any, guidance at all on how user interfaces should be built. This meant that, by and large, Android application user interfaces would span the range from very nice and professional and clean and well built, all the way down to something just thrown together in 5 minutes and uploaded to the Play Store. There was no guidance and no curation in the Android market at the time, the App Store. This was in contrast to other mobile platforms at the time, such as iOS, that from the beginning had a design language and a guideline at the time referred to as skeuomorphism that essentially guided, if not controlled, how applications should look. Skeuomorphism was essentially this notion that when something is presented on the screen that has a real world analog, then you should borrow elements from the real world object and incorporate them into the user interface component. So it meant that your Notepad app had a yellow background and lines. It meant your calendar icon would show you columns and rows representing days and weeks. And not only that, but on iOS, when it was first launched, you could not build third-party applications. All the iOS applications were built by Apple, and if you, as a third party, wanted to build for the platform, you had to build a web application. And the web designers out there already had some sense of how to put together web apps since they had been doing that for over a decade at the time. Now, that period of time essentially got Android labeled as an ugly platform. And there was a lot of truth to that label. But unfortunately, the label has by and large stuck, even though today it is not necessarily the case that Android applications are as poorly designed or poorly put together or thought out as they used to be. It is certainly not the wild, wild west of just a little over 10 years ago. Certainly it's not as curated, I would say, as other platforms might be, but it has improved. What has changed is the approach that Google has put forward for how developers and designers can put together pretty, in air quotes, and useful interfaces. It first started with a transition into what was called Holo, where Holo was something shy of a design language and more so certain types of recommendations. It introduced theming and the notion of adding shadows and complementing colors. It also introduced a few UI components that were already pre-skinned, if you will, for this new approach, but it still left a lot to be imagined. Holo hung around for a few years, and then Android released what is still today the recommended approach for building Android applications, and that is called material design. To put it simply, material design is a visual language that pulls together professional and proper design principles in an attempt to get Android applications not just to look professional on any single device, such as or a line of devices like mobile devices, but across any device, be that a phone, a tablet, a watch, a car interface, or a refrigerator. The idea is we want to make sure that there is a common thread, a common theme that encapsulates all applications' user interfaces. The material metaphor in material design is aimed at conjuring this idea of your user interface almost existing in the real world. So this moves beyond the skeuomorphism of iOS, where it doesn't just borrow visual elements, but rather, when designing a user interface, you should imagine the elements being impacted by things like light, movement, where there is inertia, touch can impact elements around the objects. And all of these get incorporated into this language that allows you to build applications that have not just an appealing presentation, but a pleasing set of interactions. So material design was essentially broken down into three categories: visual, motion, and interaction. In order to help developers incorporate material design, they're provided with tools such as themes, widgets, as well as APIs to help with more esoteric things like animations and movement. So here we see an example of themes in material design. These themes borrow heavily from the original Holo with the color schemes and highlighting and contrasts, but you also notice certain visual elements or things that come out of the visual components. For example, you notice that instead of an edit text where you type textual information, instead of being presented as just a block or a rectangle, you instead simply see a line. That line, again, is this idea that this edit text exists in the real world, and you can imagine a light source hitting an object, whether it protrudes or it's indented. We can appreciate that light hitting that object would either cast a shadow or highlight a specific area, but it wouldn't hit all four sides. So that's what this element is trying to communicate. For widgets, we have these new elements. For example, a floating action button presented in the left screenshot in the bottom right. It presents as if it is literally floating above the plane below it. And if you were to say scroll through the list, the floating action button is unaffected by the motion below it. Again, giving the sense that this other element exists further along on the z-axis and sits above the element below it. On the right, we see cards, where again we notice shadows, implying that this element is not just a part of the plane, but it sits on top of it. So the card UI component gives this notion of a card, a stock card, think of a playing card, or just a piece of paper being placed on a flat surface. In the area of APIs, we have ways to help us respond to touch events or to animate views to hide or reveal them. We have ways to do animations for transitions between activities or fragments, as well as other APIs to help with more esoteric or complex things like calculating motion that respects inertia and momentum, animate changes as a view transforms, or show animations in state lists. Finally, the most recent version of Material Design, Material 3, otherwise known as Material U, takes one additional step with regards to how a user interface is presented, where instead of relying solely on the developer and the designer to determine the final look and feel of an application, Material U will borrow hints from the user. For example, depending on the type of wallpaper that a user has enabled on their device, certain types of color schemes and contrasts and highlights might be inherited, presenting an application in a manner that is in line with other aspects of the user's preferences. This ultimately means that a single application that incorporates the Material U design APIs and recommendations and guidelines can have different looks, albeit subtle in many cases, from one device to another, or the look of an application can change as a user modifies his or her preferences. Hopefully, you'll begin to explore some of the capabilities availed to you through Material Design in an effort to improve and enhance the user's experience and user interface of your application.